Iranian chess grandmaster Parham Magsudlu, that's a great name, isn't it? Magsudlu. He was reportedly in tears this week at the end of the Grenke Freestyle Open in Germany. Freestyle is the kind of chess where the pieces on the back rank are more or less randomly arranged each game, and he had done very well in the tournament. They played 9 rounds, and by round 7 he was playing for first place against world number 1 Magnus Carlsen. But Magsudlu pushed too hard. He had an opportunity to tie the game, to get a draw. Instead, he ended up losing, falling back. But he bounced back. He won the next round. He went into the final round, tied in a 4-way tie for second. Carlsen had already secured the win, but because he had, second place was the ticket. The person who finished second would get a ticket to the Freestyle Grand Slam in Las Vegas. It was a big deal. Carlsen had already qualified, so he couldn't get the ticket. And Magsudlu was ahead in his final game. He thought he had this chance, and then his winning advantage slipped away. He finished with a tie, and he was devastated. As I said, he was reportedly in tears. But his grief was unnecessary, because in fact he had finished second. He was in a 7-way tie for second, but he owned the best tiebreak. And so here he was, devastated, crying, and in fact, he had the very thing he wanted. Grief is a natural and fitting response to any significant loss, but we sometimes grieve without cause. When we misjudge a situation, when we think we have something to grieve when we really don't, or sometimes we can grieve without hope or without perspective when we lose sight of the greatest truths that sustain us. And then when we grieve without cause or hope, sometimes that leads to bad choices, negative consequences, sometimes even tragic consequences in our life. If you're familiar with Shakespeare's tale of Romeo and Juliet, you know how that story ends tragically and unnecessarily because of grief that didn't need to be there. Sadly, grief is pervasive in America today, particularly among the young, resulting in widespread anxiety and depression. Not everybody, of course, but it's much more prevalent than in past generations. And oftentimes this leads to some very tragic outcomes. But we may wonder, is that grief necessary? Certainly a lot of the messaging and a lot of the way that a lot of what they have heard over recent years has inclined them to be grieved. But is that grief necessary in the degree that they feel it? And it's not only the young, many in other generations have experienced this as well, carry griefs with them day to day, fears and worries. To what extent has this touched our lives? And what can we do to help, both for ourselves, to keep grief in its proper place, to live in hope, and then also for others to share that hope? Last week we read the account of the empty tomb in John chapter 20, verses 1 to 10. Mary Magdalene, and although John doesn't say it, there were other women with her. She says we in one of the passages, but the focus is on Mary. She had gone to the tomb. She had found at first that it was empty, but she had made initially the wrong assumption about what that meant. So if we look back to one of the verses we looked at, she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." The empty tomb is cause for rejoicing. But all she can see is grief added to grief, that now even the body of Jesus is missing. It was a natural assumption. And we see this assumption continue on even in new circumstances in verses 11 to 13, which is where we're picking up today. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Here we see Mary at the tomb once again. Now, as I said last week, there are some questions as to what's the exact order this is happening. If you compare this with, say, the Gospel of Matthew, you'll see that the order that things are happening with the women at the tomb is a little different. Probably the reason is that for John, order is not his priority in communication. He's trying to communicate through the facts of what happened certain different other themes and points. But we see here that Mary is grieving. Now, this is a testimony to the depth of her love for Jesus, but her grief misjudges this situation. The empty tomb is cause for rejoicing, not for grief. Jesus has risen. And notice here, even an encounter with angels does not clue her in that her grief is unnecessary. She just once again repeats her lament that even Jesus' body is missing. Her grief overrides all other considerations for her. Now, she may not have recognized that these were angels right away, but the unexpected appearance of kind figures in the tomb becomes for her only an opportunity to vent her grief anew, and maybe to help her in her search for Jesus' body. But these figures are not dressed in black, they're not mourning, they're dressed in angelic white. And their positions at where Jesus' head and feet had been may recall the placement of the cherubim on the mercy seat on the top of the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament. The point here may be that Jesus' death had provided atonement, had provided a sacrifice for sins, had provided forgiveness. And surely that is a cause for gratitude and not for grief. Verses 14 and 15. When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Mary now sees Jesus. Now, she doesn't recognize him at first. Now, this may seem strange to us. This is actually one of the things that the other Gospels also independently bear witness to. For instance, in Luke, the figures on the road to Emmaus don't recognize Jesus right away. Matthew talks about the doubt that some of the disciples had. This seems strange to us and maybe perplexing, but actually it's one of the marks of authenticity of these accounts. Because if you were to make up resurrection appearances of Jesus, one thing you would not have said is that people had trouble recognizing him, or that they had doubts about him. You wouldn't say that. You would say there was no doubt. But she doesn't at first recognize him. She's blinded still by her grief. Jesus asked her the same question that the angels had. "Why are you weeping?" Weeping is not a fitting response to what's happened. And he also here asked the same question, "Who are you looking for?" that he'd asked the crowd that arrested him in the garden. Who are you looking for? Who are you seeking? Who do you want to find? Mary is looking for a dead body. And yet the resurrected Jesus is right in front of her. Mary thinks he's the gardener, somebody who's tending to the grounds. Now, in that society, that would have been a pretty lowly position. Gardeners were often people who were overlooked or misjudged, thought that they weren't much of anybody, just like many people's initial impression in The Lord of the Rings of Sam Gamgee. Gardeners wouldn't have typically had anything to do with the tomb, but Mary is grasping at straws here. She's grasping for leads. She wants to know, well, here's somebody, maybe he's moved the body. Maybe he can help me. And yet, her assumption that Jesus is the gardener isn't entirely wrong. Because one of the themes John seems to be getting at is that Jesus is the new Adam. He's the firstborn of the new creation, the new Eden, which he faithfully tends and cares for. And then, verse 16. Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. It's when Jesus calls Mary by name that she recognizes his voice. She recognizes the voice of her beloved teacher. Rabboni, it says, means teacher. It actually means my teacher. It's a very personal term of affection. What's happening here probably reflects what Jesus had said earlier in John's Gospel when he was talking about the shepherd and the sheep, talking about himself as the good shepherd. He had said in John chapter 10, verses 2 to 4, "The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice." When he calls Mary's name, she knows his voice. She recognizes that it's Jesus. Her grief is changed to joy. But, verse 17, Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." What's going on here? At first glance, it might seem like Jesus is saying something like, "Oh, I'm in a transitional phase, right? It's not good for you to touch me yet." But really, probably what's happening here is that Jesus is saying, you really want to hold on to me. You want to just stay here with me. That's natural, right? If you met someone you had loved who you thought was dead and in fact they're risen from the dead, you'd be like, "I don't want to leave your side." And Jesus is saying, "No, I'm still on a mission, and I've got a mission for you too. You can't just stay here." He's probably not telling her not to touch him. In Matthew chapter 28, I don't have it up on the screen, but when the women see Jesus, the same scene probably that John is talking about here, they grasp his feet, they fall at his feet and take hold of him. And even in John's gospel a little later, he'll invite Thomas to touch him where he'd been wounded. So don't try to keep me here. Don't try to stay here with me. And we might say, why not? Isn't this great that she could be with Jesus? Notice what he says to her, though. He gives her this message to go to my brothers. This is the first time in the Gospel of John that Jesus' disciples are called his brothers. And also it says that God is their God, that God is their Father. This is language that has been applied to Jesus throughout the gospel and is now including the disciples. This is a signal that what Jesus has accomplished on the cross and in the resurrection has made it possible for the disciples to enter God's family. And this is cause for celebration. This is good news to share. Jesus' coming ascension, that he's going to the Father, is also good news. Although, as we looked at earlier in the gospel, and we'll look at again in chapter 16, verse 7, going back a little bit, you might think that Jesus going away is bad news. But throughout the Gospel of John, it's emphasized that no, in fact, this is good news. Because when Jesus goes to the Father, that's when the Spirit is sent, empowering the church. Instead of Jesus, the risen Jesus, just being in one place, the Spirit is present with the church, empowering the church for mission, ministering grace to the people of God. And so Jesus had said in John 16:7, "Nevertheless, I tell you the truth, it is to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go away, the advocate will not come to you, but if I go, I will send him to you. And we'll talk a little more about that next week as well. But this is good news that Jesus is ascending to the Father. It's good news that he's giving Mary to share with the disciples that they are part of God's family because of what Jesus has done. This important message, this first proclamation of the gospel, really, is entrusted here to Mary Magdalene. She's not someone that the world would have thought was maybe a worthy emissary. That the eternal Son of God would give this message to her. And yet I think Jesus was very intentional in doing this. He wanted the world to know that she and others like her were equipped by God to bear this message. This wasn't a message, this was a society that valued the witness of men more than women. And yet, in this choice of her, Jesus is saying her witness is valuable. Her witness is what the disciples need to hear. This is a signal to us for all of history. And then Jesus says, we see in verse 18 that Jesus' trust of her with this commission is repaid. In verse 18 it says, Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said these things to her. Mary is able here not only to leave her grief behind, she loves Jesus so much that she stops holding on to him. She goes. She leaves his physical presence in order to be faithful, in order to carry out what he has asked of her in love. And so she shares this good news, this hope, with the other disciples. So as we think about this passage today and what this means for us, I want to ask you, where are you at today? Are you at a place in your life where you feel like grief is drowning out your hope? Where the world is stealing your joy, to use a song? Have you misjudged the situation? Have you let these things that are weighing you down obscure your vision of what God has done for us and what God is still doing in our lives and in our world? Or today, maybe you're rejoicing in hope. You're so glad Jesus is risen from the dead. You're so glad that because of this, you're a part of his family when you've embraced the gospel by faith, turned your life over to Christ. And you're rejoicing in that, and you just want to hold on to it as a prize and a possession for yourself. And yet, we're told not to just stay there, but that because Jesus is risen, he's sending us out, just like he sent Mary out. He's sending us out with this good news. That it's the disciples, yes, Mary, yes, are part of his family, but others could be as well. There's joy to be shared. Joy to be shared with the world that so often is weighed down by its grief. Hope to be shared. Sorrow may last for a night, but joy comes with the morning. We've got the joy, joy, joy. Why wouldn't we want to share that with a world in need? Let's go to the Lord in prayer.